I'm going to talk today about the Ugandan refugee movement of 1972. I call it UGX 40 because UGX was the code that we put on the visas to differentiate those immigrants coming in from Uganda at that time and to make sure that they were identified so they could get the special services that refugees get in this country. It's also the code that was used by the Department of National Defense when they set up a big reception center that I'll talk about in Long Point, Quebec. So that's the reason for that. Let's begin just a bit by taking a look at East Africa in 1972. There were 10 years into independence in 1972. The British colonies of Tanzania, Tanganyika, Kenya, and Uganda had all become independent in 60-61. They were struggling with the early phases of independence. One of the holdovers of the colonial regime was that in the late 1800s, a large number of Asian laborers, mainly from Gujarat province, were brought to East Africa by the British to build the railway that ran from Mombasa to Lake Victoria. I'm a British Columbian, and every British Columbian knows that when we pushed that railway, the CPR through the mountains of BC, there was one Chinese laborer killed for every mile of progress. In pushing that railway through, 30,000 Asian laborers died. 30,000. We lost 44,000 in the whole Second World War. So it was at a tremendous cost. The survivors, for the most part, stayed on, and they became the middle class and the commercial class of all three countries. They were typically not allowed to participate in agriculture, so they tended to go into import-export business, and also in the case of Uganda, where they first moved in any numbers at all after the First World War, they initially established a business to support agriculture, bringing in fertilizers, seeds, and then dealing in merchandising the products of the coffee and sugar and other plantations in Uganda. They were a kind of a mixed community. They were 50% of them were Gujarati Hindus. 30% were Ismaili Muslims. Those were the two large groups. They also included Sikhs, Goans, Punjabi Hindus, Ithnisharis, Boas, and other groups too small and numerous to mention. The groups were largely self-contained. They tended to specialize the different groups tended to carve out areas of the economy that they worked in. The community numbered about between 60 and 80,000. It's hard to tell in 1972 when our story begins. They were this small group in a country of 8 to 10 million people owned 80% of the businesses, 50% of the industries, and 50% of the professions were people from this community. The British had been very slow to get a proper educational system going in Uganda, so there were some big skill gaps between this community and the indigenous Ugandans, and as a result, these people moved into all sorts of areas and tended to make very good livings in it as a result. But this was an unsustainable and difficult situation, and there were a number of consequences that began to show up in the late 60s. They were an easy target for new independent governments trying to rally people around different causes and to perhaps point away from their own failings. And the African perception of the Asian communities was, one, that they were wealthy, and by African standards they most certainly were. Second, that they were aloof. There was no intermarriage, there was very little intermarriage between the Asian communities, let alone into the larger African communities, almost unheard of. And there was a perception, widely held, whether deserved or not requires more analysis than we've got time to do, but there was a perception that they exploited their position as the main merchants and whatnot in the country. So there was a resentment, and this was a resentment that was easy for governments to manipulate. The consequences were not long in coming. In 1968, the government of Kenya pulled the work permits out from under about 15,000 people who had to leave. And in fact, Canada sent a small immigration team to Kenya at that time and brought about 600 people to Canada as a result of that. In Tanzania in the early 70s, the government didn't so much push people out as simply nationalize their businesses. And people would wake up and find, for example, that the import-export sector was now the property of the Tanzanian government. And as a result, while people weren't told they had to go, their ability to earn a living disappeared. And in fact, by 1970, at the Canadian Embassy in Beirut, which was responsible for immigration from East Africa, we had one officer working full-time on the Tanzanians, going down about every 6 weeks, interviewing for a week or two, coming back, doing the processing, going down. So there was pressure everywhere on these communities. Now, things came to a head for the first point in January of 1971. The original president of Uganda, Milton Obote, had left the country to go to a Commonwealth conference in Kuala Lumpur, where actually Prime Minister Trudeau was attending as well, and woke up one morning to find that his chief of staff had mounted a coup d'etat, and he was out of a job. The gentleman who took over, if I can call him a gentleman, was an interesting chap by the name of Idi Amin Dada. He was a Commonwealth and Olympic boxing champion. He joined the army not long after the Second World War, although he liked to pretend he'd fought with the army in Burma, but in fact he'd have been, sort of a one-year-old soldier if he'd been doing that, and they didn't have that many of them those days. And he's always a good, I say, he was a grade 4 graduate, and it just shows to Goya what a little bit of education can do when you see his titles. He was a very colorful character, a very brutal character, and a very instantly famous character. The coup took place in January. By February and March, everybody in the world had heard of this guy because of his pronouncement and his peculiar behavior. And he was seen as both a funny character, but also a very dangerous character. And so people started paying attention to Uganda because of the worries that something was going to happen there. We didn't, and of course, in due course, things did happen. Now, Joe and I had just arrived in Beirut on our second posting just before Christmas in 1971, and the boss there was a guy by the name of Roger St. Vincent. Roger St. Vincent, and Roger was classic immigration officer of the era. He was a World War II veteran. Like most of the immigration people at that stage, he was an Air Force veteran. He spent most of the war flying Hurricane and Spitfire pilots from Ghana across the widest part of Africa to Cairo, where they were taken over by the desert airport and promptly shot down by the Luftwaffe, so he'd have to go back and get more. So he was one fine pilot to be able, day after day, week after week, to fly the 5 or 10 stops it took to get from the Atlantic to Cairo. He was a pilot of some considerable skill. Anyways, he told me after we'd been in Beirut and had finally found a flat, and we're about to take possession, I believe it was, of 2 mattresses and a chair, that it was time for me to get to work, and the other guys who were there had spent a lot of time on the road, and it was time for me to pick that up, and I was going to be going to East Africa to interview. Now the trick was you would go to Athens, fly to Kenya, interview for 2 weeks, fly to Lusaka, Zambia, interview for a week, fly to Mauritius, out in the middle of the Indian Ocean, and if you were lucky and planned it well, have 2 weeks there, so you had a weekend in Mauritius, which was always great fun. Fly to Dar es Salaam, interview for a week. Fly to Kenya, where there would be more files waiting for you, interview for a week. Then Kampala, Addis, interview for a day or so in Addis. Riyadh, interview for a day, home through Cairo. 6 weeks at a pop. And I remember trying to learn the names of the countries, the airports, the capitals, and the currency. And my colleagues there saying, look, Molloy, if you don't learn these things, we may get you onto the airplane, but we'll probably never see you come back. So you need to know the names of these places and what the currency is. And so I became a very diligent student of these things. Anyways, when I got through assembling the files, I noticed there were none for Uganda. So I went to see Mr. St. Vincent and said, look, Roger, I don't think I should go to Uganda. It's a waste of money. I don't have any interviews. And he said, on the contrary, there's trouble coming in Uganda. And I want you to go down there and I want you to talk to the British and the American embassies. I want you to meet the Asian community leaders. I want you to get to know that city. And I want you to get to know what's going on down there, because he said sooner or later we're going to end up there. So off you go. So I went in January. There's a picture there, the guy in the cheap Korean suit on the left-hand side. That's me, taller and thinner than I am today, although we stretched the picture a little bit to emphasize that. I have 4 lifetime friends in this picture, if you'll allow me, Cameron. This gentleman owned the main store. This was his wife, Nellie. This gentleman became the Aga Khan's legal advisor once he became a lawyer in Canada. And I don't know where his wife went. It's not her there. Anyways, these people became lifelong friends, and we see them frequently. And my children, who are, of course, Irish Canadians, have more aunties and uncles called Siddharsha and Neela and Ahmed than is quite right in an Irish family. So after the first trip, I did all my other stops and reported back. And a few months, in July, I'm down there again. This time, things were getting a little more grim. There had been an attempt to build some kind of an understanding through a series of conferences and exchanges of papers between members of the Asian community and the Idi Amin regime, and it went nowhere. And things, there were various pronouncements and measures taken that seemed to indicate that there was trouble coming. On my second trip, I got a real taste of what might be coming, because when I arrived at Sadru Ahmed's store, he said, Mike, you better come into the back. Somebody's just come into the country a bit shaken up, and I'd like you to talk to him. So I sat down with this Asian gentleman, and his story was he'd been coming in from one of the provincial towns, had heard a roar of heavy trucks on the road, assumed they probably were army trucks, pulled off and got out of sight, and watched as 3 trucks piled high with the bodies of dead soldiers went past. And what was happening was the Ugandan army had about 10,000 soldiers. The 5,000 who were loyal, came from tribes loyal to Idi Amin, were taking out soldiers from other tribes. And they killed 5,000 of them in a matter of a few weeks. And this person had seen that. So I remember going back to Nairobi and writing about this and assuming that, things certainly were not going to get better. I barely got back to Beirut, where Joe and I were planning to take a little holiday, when the next thing we know, on the 4th of August 1972, Idi Amin announced that he was expelling all the Asians who had British passports. And it's worth noting that when the British left and these countries became independent, people had an option of either taking out the nationality of the new country or retaining some kind of British connection. The British connections included documents that simply said British protected person to British subject, and I think there's 8 or 9 such different kinds of passports. Most of them had a big stamp in them saying no right of abode in the United Kingdom. So you were kind of a citizenship of a country, but you couldn't go to it. And so there probably were about 40,000 such people. So this immediately became a matter of great concern to the British government. And these are some of the headlines from a collection of newspapers that we recently acquired that show what was going on. Now, why did he do it, and why at that time? Even his ministers were surprised when he got up at some do and announced this. And he later explained, apparently, that he had no idea what he was going to say when he stood up. No idea at all. And he said, the words just came out. So it was assumed, his assumption was God had given him those words to say, that the words came from God, and it was God's will that these people be expelled. That was the first reason. Second, he said that the Asians were sabotaging the economy. Well, the Asians, in fact, for the most part, were the economy. Third, he was really obsessed with punishing the British Empire. He never, ever lost an opportunity to rail against the British Empire. And you saw with his titles, you know, Conqueror of the British Empire. And he was very anti-British, although he had a whole battalion of soldiers that wore kilts and played bagpipes. So, you know, you have to wonder. The other element was that he had been to his first international conference at an Organization of African Unity conference in Rabat, and he'd sort of fallen in with a bunch of people. You'll see the pictures over there. His heroes were Hafez al-Assad from Syria, Mubarak from Egypt, and Muammar Gaddafi. And they were his models as the kind of leaders someone in the third world should be. There's a wonderful portrait of the four of them over there. The real reason, though, for this, as far as I'm concerned, was an affair of the heart. If you read the newspapers in Kampala at the time, you see that from time to time, tribes from different parts of the country were sending girls in to marry the new president. And Idi Amin had his eye on an Asian girl, and he thought it would be nice to add her to the household. Of course, when the family heard about this, they were not necessarily all that excited, and they smuggled her out of the country. And within a fairly short time of that, these events began to unfold. So it's partly what God told him to do, partly about the economy, partly about punishing the British, partly about being a state of the world, a third country 1970s leader, and partly because he was a little annoyed that this family wouldn't send him as the president one of their daughters. So fairly complicated. So with that being said, where are we going now? Now this hit the British very, very hard. And they they had pulled out of the empire, and to their amazement, the empire came home with them. And all of a sudden, for the first time in that island's history, probably since the Normans arrived, the country was being the target of people coming from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, and the British, who thought it was all right for them to go out and colonize those people, took great exception to the reverse happening. And there was a growing level of racism. There were a couple of conservative MPs, like the likes of Enoch Powell, who made their stock in trade railing against the changing nature of the United Kingdom. So the Brits had some problems. Their economy was in extremely bad shape, and they were beginning to see race disturbances and riots around the country following the arrival of all these non-white migrants. The reaction, however, was pretty clear. British, made it clear from the start that they would meet their legal obligations to these people, even those with these rather marginal British statuses, but they wanted help. And it wasn't long before our embassy or our High Commission in Britain was called in, along with lots of others, and told, wouldn't it be nice to share this next adventure together? We've had 2 world wars together. Let's do this. They targeted 2 countries. They targeted the Indians, of course, and they targeted Canada, because Canada had made much of the fact that by 1972 we were 10 years into an immigration policy from which the formal racial barriers had been removed, and so it seemed the logical place for them to turn. When word of this arrived in Canada on the 4th of August, Prime Minister Trudeau took control of the issue immediately. He announced that it was going to be his office that would coordinate things. He caused the Manpower and Immigration Department and Foreign Affairs Department of Defense and Health Canada to set up a task force, and basically said, this is my issue, I'll deal with it. They had several meetings of cabinet, decided they didn't have enough information, and I have this vague recollection of being called in by Mr. St. Vincent and told, well, you were there last, Michael, we have requests for information, let's sit down together and write the response. Ottawa had an initial sense that somehow or other we could arrange all this without leaving Beirut, and we quickly disabused them of that notion. Although Roger particularly was not all that keen on leaving Beirut at that time and heading down to Africa for Lord only knew how long. The Canadian context at that time, despite Trudeau's positive attitude, was not particularly propitious. There was an election on the horizon. In fact, it was weeks away from being called, and at a time when Canada was just beginning to become the multicultural country it is today, the notion of bringing in non-European refugees in the middle of an election was not particularly appetizing for the government. We had 8% unemployment, was pretty high, and people were not all that, and people were concerned about that, and there was a certain amount of speculation in the press about these people are going to, 50,000 or 60,000 people are going to come from Uganda and take away our jobs. The usual thing we hear, nothing new under the sun. There was it is not an exaggeration to say that the area between Toronto and Hamilton, which is where most of the post-1962 migrants from non-traditional areas went, had not adapted completely to this business. The settlement systems were only beginning to become adept at dealing with people from these other parts of the world. The schools had not adapted, etc. And so it was not, it was not a slam dunk that we would do something. In addition to which, there was a strong perception in the country that the government had lost control of immigration, and the fact is they had. The immigration regulations of 1962. Or it was at 67, I'm sorry, had included a provision where anybody who arrived in Canada as a visitor could apply as an immigrant, and if they met the point system, they could stay. And if they didn't meet the point system, they could appeal. By 1972, the lineup to get your hearing in the Immigration and Appeal Board was 10 miles long, or 10 years long, maybe 10 miles long too. Anyways, the result of that was that there were travel agents all over the world filling up charter planes with people who would arrive particularly at Malton Airport, get off the plane and shout, "We appeal, we appeal." And because the travel agent said, well, you get at least 10 years in Canada if you can get through the door. And so there was a growing unease in Canada, and particularly within the immigration department, that this was not the way we should be doing business. So anyways, despite all this, the decision made by the government was fast, and it was positive. The British had actually formally requested our help on the 18th of August. Cabinet met on the 24th, and the decision was to first of all fire off a team to Kampala as fast as that could be done, accept an initial target of 3,000 people, take people who meet the normal immigration requirements if you can, and if you can't find enough who do so, then the minister has the authority to declare what was called the oppressed minority policy, which I'll discuss later, which would allow the officers to go way beyond the point system and select people who didn't meet the normal point criteria. The minister of the day was Bryce Mackesy. You see his signature there. Bryce eventually had to resign because he took the blame for the immigration program getting out of control. But the fact was, on the Uganda file, he made all the right decisions, and we were lucky to have him as the minister at the time. And the interesting thing was that the Prime Minister made the announcement of what we were going to do right up front, and he set the tone. He made quite a long statement about what was going on and what Canada was going to do about it. But he ended by saying this: "We are prepared to offer an honorable place in Canadian life to those Ugandan Asians who come to Canada, and I am sure that they will, by their abilities and industry, make an important contribution to Canadian society." Now, I can't tell you how important it was to us as young Canadian civil servants being sent off to some faraway country to have that statement from our Prime Minister. That when in moments of doubt and in moments of uncertainty and in moments where we were really ticked off, which as time went on, that happened quite frequently as we got more and more tired, recalling those words steadied us down and gave us a very good sense of what the government's will was. So we never had doubts about whether the government was behind what we were doing or not. And that kind of leadership is something we seldom see with such clarity when these sorts of things happen. That sort of one long sentence was our mantra. They told us what was expected of us and gave us a clue as to how we were expected to behave. The reaction in Canada was muted. There was, when you look at the newspapers and the op-eds and the reporting, it's largely neutral, somewhat apprehensive, but if you look at the letters to the editor, initially they're very negative, and the Prime Ministerial and Immigration Minister's mail was running 3-1 against. So it was, it wasn't as if a lot of people immediately said this is a good idea. And apparently the talk shows at the time went crazy. What are we doing? We've got all these unemployed people, and they're going to come in and take our jobs. Just to hold, go back one, Joe, before we look at that. The cartoons of the day would never make it onto the pages of a Canadian newspaper today. It's really interesting to see how our sense of political correctness has changed over that time. And there's about 10 or 15 cartoons that we've collected, most of which we're not going to run before you. But this one I show you for a couple of reasons. First of all, my mother sent me this. It first appeared in the Toronto Citizen, and she got it out of the Maclean's magazine. And when it arrived, I stapled it to my demand guide that I was using to screen the refugees. And the caption was quite interesting. It said, "You won't find any job discrimination in Canada because of racism, color, or religion." Mind you, you won't find a job either. So, but what made us laugh there was the following. Because this was the end of the 60s. We were wearing blue jeans, bell-bottom, like this. Everybody had colorful shirts. When we got to Africa, we all bought beads and bracelets and all that stuff. Most of us had pretty long hair. And in fact, two of the Sikh volunteer girls who worked with us took us home one night to meet their dad, and we spent the evening learning how to tie turbans. So we thought the Canadian officers looked more like this. And the Asian immigrants who wanted to make a good impression all arrived in three-piece suits and ties, and the ladies in their best bib and tucker. And so we thought, these guys, these cartoonists have got it wrong. But it's a sign of, you won't see this today, but it's an interesting indication of the time, but the impact on us was the opposite of what people might have thought. Now, so that's the lead up. The next thing was, of course, the cabinet having decided to send this team. The next thing that happened was my boss, Roger St. Vincent, received his marching orders. And in those days, the most popular thing on television was Mission Impossible. So look at how the orders were couched. Your mission is to proceed. They deliberately parodied the opening lines of a Mission Impossible statement, very deliberately, which gave us a good laugh as we were contemplating the full magnitude of what it was we were going to face. Now, what is interesting there is you get two things. You get Asians who meet the immigration selection criteria, bearing in mind their particular plight. And this was the kind of ambiguity that we got in the messages all the way along. You're to use the point system first, but that you don't stop there. And that was the message we took from this. That the point system would be our guide, and anybody who met the point system who came to us would be taken, but we would not stop there, that we would go beyond it. So that was what we got. Now, Roger this came in a very interesting week for Joe and me, because we had a new doctor who'd arrived at the embassy, and we went in to see him, and he took one look at Joe and said, "You're not having that baby in this country. Do you want us to go to Golden, BC with your mother-in-law? Do you want to go to Vancouver with your mother? But I want you on an airplane this weekend," because there were some complications. At the same time, I received a message from Immigration Headquarters saying, "Don't get too comfortable there, Molloy, because we're sending you to the United States." We hadn't even been there a year. "We're sending you to the U.S. to open a new visa office." And then, we were kind of staggering under that. And as we came out of the doctor's office, the boss's secretary said, "You better go see Roger, Mike. He's got something to tell you." And he showed me that message. On the bottom there was a line that said, "As Molloy is a seasoned officer, he will accompany you as your assistant." Well, I was 3 years into the job and had not thought of myself as being anything like seasoned. So in the next 5 or 6 days, as Roger left, the telephone arrived. We'd been there 9 months. The telephone was installed just as this happened. So we used it to call the movers and to cancel the lease. And in 5 days, we canceled the lease. We packed up the stuff. We got everything gone. We got tickets for Joe and the kids, saw them off. The last day there, I oversaw our goods being put into a lift van, and then headed off to the hotel with my bags and stuff and the supplies that I was supposed to bring. Flew to Athens and had a day to wait there before my flight. And so I checked into a hotel, and as I was dozing off, a little voice in the back of my head said, "What did you do with your car?" Which was a question that troubled me for quite a few days after that. A little bit of an overload. Now let's just have a quick look at the context of Canadian policy at that stage, so you can understand what comes next. In terms of immigration policy, we were still working under the 1952 Immigration Act, which was an act that told you in great detail who to throw out and how. It said nothing about who to let in. It said nothing about immigration or visitors. It had just long lists of how you deport people, how you prevent them from coming in. Nevertheless, and it had nothing to say at all about any immigrants coming in, let alone refugees. Notwithstanding that, between the putting into place of that act and 1972, we'd resettled 300,000 refugees. So the act was not an impediment. It was just no particular help. 1962, as I mentioned, Canada dropped the racial barriers. Now, why did they do that? It is not as if they went out and asked the population, "Would you like this country to change?" In fact, it was done largely by stealth, a quiet, unannounced regulation change. But there were several things happening in the country. First, our leaders were going off to Commonwealth and UN meetings and being asked by their Commonwealth counterparts, "How can you be part of our multiracial Commonwealth or United Nations and close the door to our citizens? What's going on there?" And so at the top there was pressure. I think at the bottom there was something else happening too. The values of the country were changing, and we were seeing on television the ugly side of racism in South Africa, in the American South, various other places. And while we were no more immune to racism than anyone else, we realized what we were seeing was not something we liked. And so I think while the country had not been prepared, in 62 the rules changed. And that led to kind of a barroom brawl, because we had no selection criteria then. Before that, it was go get Brits and Northern Europeans, and on a day when you're feeling generous, maybe a few Italians, but there was no system. And so that led in 67 to the famous point system, which was the first system for immigration ever put in place, which tried to avoid race or nationality or religion, and had a bunch of more or less objective criteria, age, education, skill, occupation, those sorts of things, that you could apply to anybody applying anywhere around the world and get exactly the same results, regardless, for the people with the same qualifications, whether they were living in Britain or Bangladesh. The other thing that's worth just noting in passing, from a historical point of view, is that the buzzword for immigration at that stage was universality. The government made much of the fact that we now had a universal immigration policy as opposed to one that focused on the traditional sources. And And this was considered you know, quite a big step forward. And I must say, as young officers, we had an awful lot of confidence in the point system, and we're prepared to die defending it, because it was such a change from what the officers before us had been dealing with. On the refugee front, the things were changing too. In 1969, as you probably all know, Canada ratified the 1951 Refugee Convention and the 67 Protocol, and immediately thereafter, within months, Cabinet sat down to look at a set of recommendations to bring Canada's overseas system into line with this. Now, the convention doesn't say very much about resettlement, but it does provide a definition. And so Cabinet decided, one, we would accept that definition of refugee, which is a definition, as you all know, based on a well-founded fear of persecution and being outside your country, right? That's what a refugee is. Cabinet also, at the same time, said that doesn't always work, because by that stage we had a whole series of appeals to help people still in their own country who were facing pressures. Moroccan Jews were one group. There were a number of Armenian groups that were still in their country of nationality that were having great difficulties, and that we were being pressured to do something about. So they said, we're going to have a new policy called the oppressed minority policy, and that means when the Cabinet decides this group are going to be designated as oppressed minorities, visa officers were then required to select them as if they were refugees. Now, how were refugees to be selected? They had to apply with the definition, and at that stage, they still had to comply with the point system. But one of the things about the point system, when we were filling in our forms, putting the numbers and personal assessments, the last box on the page, and it took about an eighth of it, is, do you wish to override the system and exercise your discretion? It wasn't as if discretion was something you had to pull out of the air. It was staring you in the face every time you interviewed someone. The last box on the page said, you know, you'd look at the numbers and they were 50 points you're in, more than that you're in, less than that you're out. But you always had the option of saying, I'm going to override the system, writing up the reasons for why, and normally taking it to your boss, who in most cases would just endorse it, and that was it. So that was built right in. So Cabinet looks at it in September, and in January, a few months later, out comes something called Operations Memorandum 17, and those were the rules. That was our instructions. This is how you deal with refugees. Convention definition, press minority, point system, but applied with generosity, making lots of use of discretion. And those were the rules that we were working under as we headed to Kampala. Now, Roger arrived the last day of September in beautiful Kampala, one of the prettier towns in Africa, built on 7 hills in those days. Just an absolutely lovely place. And the white building in the back is historically important because that's where we stayed. It was the Apollo International Hotel. That's an earlier picture. In this one, you can see the hotel, but you see the black building. That was the IPS building, which was the Ismaili mutual fund kind of building, and the British had an eye on it because there was a space about twice the size of this room on the ground floor, which was a perfect place to set up a visa operation. When they went to them, the owners who I'd met on my previous trips said, you can have the basement, but this is not available yet. And as soon as Roger arrived in Kampala and went looking for space, he was told, oh, we have some space. So we got the ground floor. It had a huge terrace with a roof over it, and it was just there waiting for us. There were 2 offices upstairs with telex machines, so we had communications. The British Embassy, who were not terribly happy of not getting the space, were really good to us. They made sure we got telephones and telegraph addresses. And within 4 days of arrival, Roger not only had that and had a fleet of minibuses, but he had got a hold of a Channel Islander who had a carpenter shop and made the guy build us the front counter and booths to do the medical exams in with curtains and that stuff. And he hijacked some poor Sikh carpenter from Mbali, and said to the guy, I need 45 chairs, 10 with cushions, and about 30 or 40 tables, and I need them in 48 hours. And the man said, it can't be done. And he said, well, then we're going to put up a sign on the front of our office saying, I'm sorry, we can't open today because Mr. Singh hasn't delivered the furniture. Now, I arrived on the 5th, having picked up a whole bunch of flags at Roger's request from the Canadian High Commission in Nairobi. And as I stumbled into this space with my suitcases and the flags and boxes of files, I saw all this furniture coming in. I stopped to look and saw all sorts of people I didn't know, because teams, officers that had arrived from 4 or 5 of our European posts, medical team had come in from Ottawa, doctors, visa typing experts, PR people, and the minister's political assistant. And there were people I'd never seen before. So I stop and look around and see all this furniture coming in. And I hear from the back of the room Roger's voice, well, did you come to look, Molloy, or are you planning to work? So I thought, okay, well, obviously he seems quite serious. So by the 4th or by the 5th, we were all in place. The only flaw in the ointment is he'd gone out and got a bunch of manual typewriters. And the secretaries from Ottawa took one look at them and said, no, 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 no. That will not do. Roger was quite stunned by that, but we sent people off into the hinterland, and they arrived with several bought and a number of borrowed electric typewriters to the satisfaction of our visa typing ladies. The only thing that we didn't have on that date were the medical technicians to do the medical exams, and I'll come to that later. Now, we had a bit of a challenge. From the day we opened, we had 63 days to move as many people as we could, which meant there's no way you're going to send mail out to people. The telephone system worked only intermittently. How do we communicate with them? And it was at that moment that the clerk who had come along with the team from Ottawa, a guy by the name of Jim McMaster, whose name is forever engraved on my heart with gratitude, opened his briefcase and pulled out a little silver stamping machine. And it would stamp numbers, and it would repeat them. You could stamp it 3 times or 4 times, and then at a certain stage it would move on to the next number. So he said, well, look, why don't we do this? When people bring in their application, we'll stamp that number on it, and we'll stamp it on something else. In fact, we've got this paper that we have to give them from the British Embassy saying how you get your tax clearances, what the British were giving out to their people. We'll stamp it on that. We'll give it to them and say, look, mate, this is your number. Watch for it in the paper. Watch for it in the window over there. And so this was we didn't even have to make index cards or anything like that. Our file recall system were the people themselves. So it saved a huge amount of work. It was completely secure. As long as you didn't tell other people what your number was, nobody knew what it meant. And you'll see every day, every 2 or 3 days, we'd put a whole bunch of these lists in the Uganda Argus. And I have met very few people from Uganda when I come up to and say, well, what was your number? If they were adults at the time, they will often say, well, my number was 417, or my one was 55266. Because that number became the most important commodity. It was like a lottery number. And they were regarded with life. And people not only knew their own numbers, they knew their auntie's numbers and their uncle's numbers and their brother's numbers and their sister's numbers. And they would come in and look at the window, and you'd see them with a list looking not only for their number, but everybody else's. So in the pre-internet Twitter age, this was what we had. And it worked like a bomb. It was fantastic. It was really terrific. It was discreet, it was fast, and by the 3rd week we were there, we were getting telegrams and other communications from relatives and friends in Canada saying, I would like to bring in, if you send Mr. Muhammad Ali your number, blah, 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 we will look after them. So the community communicated to their friends and relatives in Canada with amazing rapidity what their numbers were, and we were getting these incoming telegrams, which of course was really helpful in matching up the offers of help. The opening day was the 6th of September, and we had these minibuses, so the girls and the older fellows and the doctors and all the dignified people got in the buses to head to the office at about 7:30 in the morning. The guys, us guys from the settlement group, we're going to walk. So we come down the hill, and we get onto Kampala Road, and as we get onto Kampala, which runs along here, we realize all these Asians are standing around on the sidewalk, looking this way, looking that way, looking at us. We don't, you know, penny didn't drop with us, didn't think any. We're walking along towards the office, all these Asians standing on the sidewalk. You look back as far as you can see, there's Asians standing on the sidewalk. You look ahead, we come around the office, to the corner of the office. Guess what? This is a lineup and it ends at our front door. So all of a sudden we realize we have business. The first day, everybody was there, we'll never forget it. At one stage, it became quite exciting because some people got to the line late and decided that since they were who they were, they would go up to the front. And this was not really appreciated, and a huge fist fight broke out. And the minister's assistant, for reasons I cannot understand, went out to restore order and lost his shirt in the process. But a big, tall Asian man, who we quickly christened Goliath, intervened, restored order. He got a visa very early in the process, and order was restored. There was nothing, and Roger's brainwave for that day was, since there was no visas to type, we took the 3 young ladies from the visa typing team, and we put them on the front desk. So the first people that these people saw when they came were these 3 very nice young Canadian women who were so excited to be there. Most of them had never been out of Ottawa before, let alone to Uganda. And for them, it was the great adventure of their lives. It still is. They're friends of mine to this day. And so these people got greeted by these wonderful gals. There was a 4th woman who showed up, a 4th Canadian woman who showed up and was with us for the first week or 2. She turned out to be a model from Edmonton who was there with her Asian boyfriend to meet the family. And when she heard about this, she came to work. Well, she was an absolute knockout. I don't want to be sexist or anything, but I think we got so many clients because word spread that there was something quite special at the front there. And she worked for us for a couple of weeks until it was time for her to go. The first day, those women passed out 2,588 applications, covering over 7,000 family members. And we interviewed everybody that claimed immediately to have any kind of connection with Canada. As the applications came in, we started, we had to do the screening and figure out who we were going to deal with. But it was really a day to remember. Just a couple at the end of the first, by the end of the first day, we had ended on a somber note. About 8 o'clock, we all made it back to the hotel. We were all in quite a happy mood because we'd got through the day, and it was clear we were going to have some business. And word came of the Munich massacre, the massacre of the athletes at the Munich Olympics, and Xavi decided that it was because Amin was becoming quite strident in terms of his own Islamic affiliation. Xavi decided it was time for him to leave, and we all agreed, so he left that night. These 2 photos are ones that just came to light, and they hadn't been seen for years and years and years. These are just shots of our office. The lady there came in to volunteer for us and worked with me and with the visa production people, and was about the 4th week we were there, the word went out that anybody who had, that most Ugandans had cheated on getting their citizenship. And so they were to report to a certain ministry and have their papers checked. And there was a very arbitrary system. Some people were confirmed, others had their documents taken away. But halfway through the day, a company of soldiers showed up, and they went down the line and simply took away all the documents. And from that moment, when we reported that to Ottawa, the instructions came back: you treat Ugandan citizen Asians as if they were stateless. We do not believe that their passport provides them any protection. So that was anyways, this lady went out in the morning to have her application, her citizenship verified, and she had been on the Olympic team of Uganda, had no sense at all she was going to lose it, came back about 4 hours later absolutely shattered because they'd taken her citizenship away. She is today the president of the Hamilton Police Services Board, having retired as the superintendent of the Hamilton Catholic School Board. So, you know, shows anyone from anywhere can do well if they get a lucky break. Here's the outside. This is the only picture taken of that. I remember the day I took this picture, and I was feeling so guilty at being away from my desk. And as indistinct as it is, you can see this cluster of people in light shirts, and you can see on the window, those are the lists. And people are coming in to check whether their numbers are on there and whether they're going to be called up. I see in my notes here two things. My babysitter from Pioneer Gold Mine, when I was a little boy, showed up as a nurse that day and said, I'll work for you guys. It was kind of odd to run into your babysitter from Pioneer Gold Mine, British Columbia, in the middle of Kampala. And the same day, Mr. Madevji showed up with 200 or 300 chairs. So not only did our people have the shade, which the poor people working with the going to the British didn't have, they had chairs to sit on, and it's sort of, you know, we didn't mind that at all. Processing was, I'll just give you a rapid sense of it. People would come in, the first thing, after we'd stamped their numbers, gave them the form, you'd run it through the point system, and if they met the point system, regardless of their citizenship, they were put on an interview list. If they didn't meet the point system, then you'd look at their what documents they had. If they had some place to go, oh no, second, do they have any connections in Canada? Friends, relatives, anything at all? Again, they go into the interview list. If they didn't meet the point system and they had somewhere else to go, they had a British passport, an Indian passport, we'd simply say to them, not now, go to Britain, go wherever else, and apply from there. We're going to deal with it. If they had nowhere to go, and there were lots of people who were stateless, and then we had the Ugandan Asians with Ugandan documents, which weren't worth the paper they were written on, we would say, okay, those are people we're going to interview. So we focused on those who qualified and those with nowhere to go. And I think that was the best way we could do it. You know, we had complaints from various communities. You're not seeing our people. Your people have someplace to go. We're here for those that don't. The interview, we each had to do about 30 interviews a day, which was kind of a lot. And you had to really spin them through and make your decision immediately. Very, very tiring, I found. One of my colleagues, Jacques Dupeau, eventually worked up to 50 interviews a day and then collapsed. And we had to send him home for 2 weeks on a charter. So I never tried to do 50. But it was really heavy work. After that, I mentioned we began to get these sponsorships coming in. There was no sponsorship system, but we'd get these floods of every day. In fact, so much so that eventually we had to sit down and spend a couple of days matching them up with the applications because we had so many of them. They were really helpful to us, though, to have those things. Students, Canadian professor from McGill walked in one day and said, hey, you know what? I've got 29 medical students from Makerere University who have just been given the boot. Why don't we take them to Canada? And I said, well, what are you prepared to do? And he reached in his pocket and pulled out a telegram from the president of the Association of Canadian Universities and Colleges saying, dear Professor X, if the Canadians will give them visas, we will place them. Of the 29, which I interviewed on a Sunday, 5 at a time, to get through the day, of the 29, 28 came to Canada, and the other one got a scholarship to Britain. So, and the WUSC Student Refugee Program is based on that incident. Sponsorship, students, medicals. Big problem we had, the doctors, the head doctor, who I'll talk about in a minute, would not allow his doctors to look at anybody to do the physical examination until the tropical medical tests were done. So that meant an X-ray, radiologist report, urinalysis, blood test, and oh, the great horror of all, a stool test for parasites. Well, I'll tell you more about that later. Then the next thing to do was you had to produce the visas, and that was where those young women came through. They were really, really fantastic. And particularly once we moved them up to one of the offices where they weren't disturbed, they could produce 400 to 500 visas a day, which was really useful. Then we had to think about getting them on an airplane, booking them, and finally getting them out to the airport safely. So that was the process. I want to just tell you about 2 of these characters. After the brawl the first day in front of the office, Ottawa was under the misapprehension that somehow or other we needed more security, which we really didn't. So they sent the toughest guy in the immigration department, Mr. Mo Benoit of Hull, Quebec. Mo had been a sailor in the Canadian Navy in the Second World War, and he was one tough guy. He was in a minesweeper in the Bay of Biscay in the North Atlantic, and his ship was torpedoed. So Mo and those who weren't killed in the explosion ended up in the water, middle of the winter. Most of his fellow crewmen eventually drifted into unconsciousness. Mo survived because of the pain of his broken collarbone, and eventually, after several hours in the water, he was rescued. He gets on board this next ship. They put blankets on him, feed them up, warm them up, and guess what? Second torpedo, the second ship goes down. Again, Mo was one of the few survivors of the second ship. So he was a rough customer, but he had earned the right to be. And although he and I occasionally had differences, he was somebody I respected all my life because this was a guy who paid his due. The other gentleman up in the corner, Louis Mack, and Louis was a Czech refugee from the 1948 Russian coup in Czechoslovakia, and he worked on every refugee program we ever had up to the day he retired. So this is some of my older colleagues. The medical delays were the bane of our existence. When we figured out that it was done very rapidly, that the medical system in Kampala couldn't handle all that we needed to do, we sent out a flare, and 7 days later, a DC-10 arrived with 5 or 6 Canadian Army medical technicians and 8 tons of equipment. They put up a big tent in the back of the hotel to do some of their tests, and within 10 minutes of the tent going up, it was a wonderful tent made for European conditions with vents about this big. Within 10 minutes, the temperature in the tent was over 100 degrees, and the blood samples began to boil. So our clerk was sent out to scour the town for fans and all sorts of stuff. Anyways, they were behind us. And the result of that was we couldn't issue visas because we didn't have medical clearances. And the first 3 flights had to be canceled. And when we got to the when we finally got to the 27th, where we were able to almost load an airplane, again, we couldn't completely do it because we didn't have enough meds. And in fact, the next 2 flights left almost half full. Again, no medical clearances. Part of the problem was the fact that my boss, Roger St. Vincent, the guy pointing, that's why I do that, and the gentleman in the floral shirt, Dr. Marcel Pichet, had issues going back to the displaced person camps of Europe in 1948 and 49. Whoever put the 2 of them in the same tomb was absolutely nuts, because these guys did not like each other at all, and they both had given each other lots of reasons not to like each other over a period of more than 10 years, close to 20 years. So they arrived there, and you could generate electricity with what went on back and forth between them. But Pichet absolutely was not going to handle the medicals until they had the whole package. Technically, he was right, but man, he caused us a lot of grief while we were waiting. Now, the good news was that the technicians were really, really good guys. And once they realized what was happening, they really put their backs into it and did what Canadian soldiers normally do when the push is on. Now, 13th of September, just 7 days into our 6 or 7 days into our operation, the medical technicians arrived, so the Army really moved fast once we sent up the flare. But the cabinet met again, because it was clear we were phoning in our stats every single night to Ottawa. There's no other way to get them there, and they were phoned in using 1940s French Canadian slang, because every time you went to phone and you had to go downstairs to do it, there were guys on either side of you who spoke French listening, and the line was bugged. So Roger and the guys on the other end used their 1940s French Canadian slang to convey the numbers and messages back and forth, and really annoyed the Ugandan security service. Anyways, 13th of September, it's clear to the people in Canada, the cabinet, that we need a bigger quota than 13 for sure. Mackesy wanted, and now we're in an election. It's a big problem because the press doesn't know the number who are coming, and you're getting lurid speculation. 60,000 people are coming to Canada, 15,000 people to Canada, what will we do? So a lot of the cabinet members, including the Minister of Finance, were demanding that Mackesy declare this a refugee movement, meaning he could cap it. Now, there's no legality to that, but that's what they believe. Mackesy, on the other hand, didn't want to cap it. He wanted 8,000. And if he'd have got 8,000, if he'd sent us a hell of a lot more officers that day. But in any event, he said, no, we're going to keep the point system, because he knew if he could see the use of discretion in our decisions, and he knew we were applying the rules really generously. And once you said yes to somebody under the point system, you couldn't let them go. So he wanted us to run as hard as we could. He won the battle. He didn't get the 8,000 approved, but he was told, once you get past 6,000, you better come back for more money. So that was the decision that we got from there. The other thing Cabinet decided, which led to some interesting moments, was that since they couldn't announce the number, they weren't going to say anything about numbers. They would just say, well, conditions are complicated. We'll know when the girls out there are finished. But this did not satisfy anybody, and they took a lot of political pressure because they wouldn't cap the movement. But I think they made the right thing. So we get into week 2, into week 3. The team is beginning to come together. The technicians have finally got their cool tent up and everything. But things don't get any better. The medical stills aren't coming through fast enough. We're having to cancel flights. In Ottawa, they're muttering about firing Roger and putting somebody else in charge. And in addition, as if our life wasn't complicated enough, followers of Milton Obote invade the country. So we're sitting there, and all of a sudden there's a war going on. And life in the town gets it gets very, very dicey. We spend a week, nobody's allowed to go out on the street. You're in the bus going to work, going back to work. And at night, because the Ugandans had some kind of thing up on top of the building where listening to radios and stuff, if you were having dinner, and we couldn't go out, if you were having dinner in the hotel, and you even talked at a whisper, a soldier would come in and yell at you to shut up. So it was really kind of a creepy time. More important than that, though, was the fact that security in the country really fell apart. And it became very, very dangerous for people to travel in on the roads. And the discipline of the army, which was never actually a standard to emulate by anybody else, began to really fall apart, and lots of people started getting hurt. Not so much Asians, but ordinary Ugandans started getting hurt in very large numbers. And so life became very, very unpleasant and dangerous for us all. So when things were, and we went through 2 very unpleasant weeks. Happily, in early October, we came to Uganda National Day, and everybody in town took 3 days off, and we decided to do the same. That weekend, we got a whole new slew of visa typists, a whole new bunch of visa officers, and 3 or 4 more doctors. So we sent the original staff off to spend a few days on the beach in Mombasa, and the rest of us knuckled down. That weekend, I think they produced something like 1,000 visas, and we went through 8,000 files and pulled something over 2,000 of them out for further interviews, and were able then to put in the window lists of appointments right up until the final deadline. And from that moment on, things worked really, really quickly. We then had another problem. We were doing the selection, we're doing the medical, but now you come to the point where you've got to bring all the results of the interviews, the medicals together, produce the visa, and then figure out which plane these people are going to go on, or are they going to go on a plane. So Roger St. Vincent, in a moment of genius, picked the youngest of our team, Jerry Campbell, 3-time ambassador Jerry Campbell today, but in those days, a guy with 4 whole weeks of interviewing experience in London and 2 whole weeks of interviewing experience with me, was told, you are going to run the unit that pulls all this information together, produces the visas, does the bookings, and gets our people safely out to the airport. Just one quick thing. This is the first visa. And if anybody knows Sami Moradali, I'd like to catch up with her and have her see her again. Anyway, another quick shot. Just pictures of the medical technicians. This is the guy. I think he was 22 years old. The fellow with the worried look on his face. Never saw him without that for the rest of the team, because his job was to get everything together and get those people out to the airport safely. And it was a career-building, character-building exercise for young Jerry. His Excellency, as we call him these days. Now, just a few. Roger had a way of managing that was quite unique, and I learned a lot from it. We called it the black label management system. And that meant that at the end of every day, we'd normally be finished by 7:30. And we were finished when I got all the statistics counted up, which was very difficult because I'm not very good with numbers. And he really was. All the interviewing officers and all the section chiefs were required to be in his room at 7:30. And the older guys got to sit on chairs, and the rest of us got to sit on the floor. And Roger would open up a bottle of 40-ounce or a black label scotch, and it would be passed up and down the rows, back and forth. And as we loosened up, he'd start asking questions about how it went today. And we would talk about what was going well and what was not going well and where the screw-ups were. And he would say, so what are we going to do about that? And as long as we came up with a solution, he'd make it so. And the only time he ever made a decision on our behalf was when we couldn't figure out what to do. But he pulled all the solutions out of our heads. Lubricated occasionally with another glass of scotch. But it's a system that I used time and time again with less scotch, mind you, than he did. But mind you, normally we weren't under that kind of stress. But it was that his wisdom in saying, it's the people who are doing the work who'll probably have the solution, if I can just get them relaxed enough to think about it. We had a few battles about it. Now, moving right along. First flight finally got off on the 27th of September. It wasn't full, but it was a flight. The poor people on it, it took 30 hours to get to Canada. Something fell off the plane along the way, and they had to land in Paris and get it glued back on. We went from like a flight every third day to a flight every other day to a flight every day to 10 flights a week by the end of at the end of it, which meant there were days when we'd go out there and there'd be two airplanes with Canadian flags on them sitting on the tarmac, and we had to move the people out. The real trick, the real problem was, how do you get people safely out to that airport? There are 4 checkpoints manned by an increasingly unruly army and policemen. How do you get it out? So what we did was we had a car and we put a flag on it, no ambassador, not the sort of thing you do. Put the flag on the car, that would lead. We had a couple of guys from External Affairs that were there as our kind of minders. And we'd get 3 or 4 or 5 buses, whatever was needed. And the flags that I brought from Nairobi, huge flags, we would drape over the buses. And so that we'd have the lead car with the flag and the buses festooned with flags. And it made such an impressive sight, we were never stopped. We kept right through. The other thing we did is Mo Benoit, the big tough sailor, and 2 or 3 of the soldiers, plus Jerry Campbell, who was a pretty tough kid, and a very nice, very personable, nice clerk from Nairobi who speaks Swahili, were the team that would go out. And they would make sure that as people went through the processing, nobody was hassled, nobody was robbed. So protecting those people began at our parking lot at the hotel, and we saw them safely and the team stayed there till the plane was in the air. So our people, unlike a lot of people going to other places, who arrived at the airport with nothing but their clothing on their backs because they'd been robbed on the way, our people got out there very safely, and it was fairly good. Now we're coming to getting close to the end. You'll be relieved to know. This is a picture of the Sojani family arriving in Hamilton. They were on the very first flight. And the people of Hamilton welcomed them with a 4-picture spread in the Spectator. They still live here. And a few months ago, when they heard we were doing this project, out of the blue, they sent me an email. And they said, you know, we were on the first flight, and we're so glad you're doing this work, and how can we help? And then they said something that blew me away. We were in a large mess hall. We were like zombies going through immigration. There were 9 black and white televisions and 2 color televisions showing ice hockey. There were a number of army and civilian personnel. Suddenly, all the white personnel started dancing and hugging and kissing each other, and some of us Ugandans. He shoots, he scores. Canada beats the Russians at our own game. Blessed Paul Henderson. So, the first group arrived the morning of the great game, the last game of the Summit Series. And there they were, for it, and they celebrate. And I have had, it's either 9 or 10 families on that flight that I've met over the years, and they always tell me about the huge hullabaloo when Henderson scored the game. So that's a kind of a really neat connection with our social and cultural history that these people actually participated. I think it's quite wonderful. Now, there's another bit of a story, and here we depart a little bit from facts and move into the realm of legend. The facts, and I got 98% of these facts are verified. There's 2% where you have to bear with me. This is the dining room of the government guest house in Ottawa. And on the 28th of September, the same day as the game, the same day as the first flight arrives, His Highness the Aga Khan happened to be in Ottawa to establish a fund so his followers could borrow money if they wanted to start businesses in Canada. He was a pretty good friend of Trudeau, so he went to Ottawa, and his mission was to determine how many we were going to take. Now remember, Cabinet had said we're not talking about the numbers, and even though he saw Trudeau and the immigration minister and the foreign minister, nobody would give him anything but more, sort of more or less vague, oh well, we'll take as many as we can kind of things. So Aga Khan merits head of state protocol treatment, so of course there has to be an official lunch. They're coming up to lunch, and of course there's something else going on that's quite important to Canadians. So it turns out Trudeau had an appointment with his television set. And so it was bounced to the foreign minister, who had also had an appointment, as did the immigration minister, as had the deputy ministers, the associate deputy ministers, the directors general, and the directors. And so eventually the buck got passed down to a gentleman by the name of Jim Cross, who was a section chief in charge of about 4 or 5 people. And he was told, Jim, you have the great honor of representing Canada and being host to the Aga Khan at lunch today, while the rest of us are watching television. Now, what I have figured out from the story in my conversation with Jim is something like this happened. Jim arrives, not happy, and he's got his four people who work for him. They're not happy either, but they're doing their duty as Canadians. They arrive, the wine is served, and the first thing Jim grabs the maitre d' and says, you guys have got a TV set going in there, haven't you? Well, of course we have. So they agree that somehow or other, with the Aga Khan sitting there with his back to that door, and that's the door to the kitchen, that as the scores change in the game, the maitre d' will come to open the door and signal. And my suspicion is left-hand Russians, after all, they're commies, right-hand Canadians score. Okay? So the lunch goes on. And occasionally the Canadians get either up or down. And I'm sure His Highness, who was a very perceptive man, couldn't quite figure out what the hell was going on here. But eventually at some point, and at one point in the game, and Joe and I have found it, there's a 1.5 minute segment of time when the score is 3-3. At that moment, the Aga Khan finally leans across the table and says, really, Mr. Cross, you have to tell me how many you're planning to take. The door opens. So without realizing he's being stared at intensely, Mr. Cross puts 6 fingers down on the table. All the Canadians look at that with great satisfaction. His Highness catches it and says, 6,000. That would be splendid. It's an almost true story. Moving right along. Coming to the end. Now, just a word or two on the reception arrangements, because they're important to our future immigration and refugee history. The Army was tasked to turn Canadian Forces Base's Long Point, which is the base in Montreal, into the reception center. And the Army went all out. They created a facility with 1,000 beds, and they needed them as we got to the end of our process. And so here's a picture. Now, the Army was extremely proud of the fact that they recruited the owner of the Maharaja restaurant in Montreal to come out to the base and teach the cooks how to make Indian food. Remember, Canada in 1972, there was not a single Indian restaurant in all of Ottawa, although I was shortly going to fix that. And so they were extremely proud, and in fact, when we found these photos in the archives, my research assistant, there was a description of what's in each of those trays on the archival record. You know, curried lamb chops, lamb curry, aloo saag, da 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 da. And my research assistant turns to me and says, with a little bit of dribble coming down, "We're going for Indian food for lunch, aren't we?" So that was the curry. So that's the. Oh yes, and it turns out that the president of the Canadian Indian Association, a person of some consequence, went out to the base and taught the cooks how to make chapatis. So the Army was really very proud of that. And this is a picture of Nurse McGinty, who I think the photographer had something for, because there's more pictures of Nurse McGinty than anyone else. She ran the nursery and the little clinic we had there. We had doctors and a little hospital for them. And there, according to the record, she is teaching the Asian women the wonders of disposable diapers. And this is the Popat family of Halifax, a lovely family I met a few months ago when I was down at Pier 21. This is a photo of them in their new winter coats. And you can see the two sets of identical coats, gray and brown. I don't know whether Zellers cleaned out their bargain basement or whatever, but everybody got winter clothing because these people are arriving from the equator, and it's September, October, November. So that's, and finally counseling. And we showed this the other night in Waterloo, and somebody said, "I know those people." So in those days we were manpower and immigration. So there were immigration people there to do the landing, but the manpower people from all across the country were sent in, and so people were counseled on, well, there's jobs for your occupation here, there, and everywhere, and the decisions about where people went if they didn't have relatives were made by those manpower counselors. And for the most part, it worked out. It seems to have worked out very well. Is that it? Yes. And one final story, and then we'll bring to an end. About 6 weeks in, we are busy. But the machine is working now. The team is working, the meds are coming, the visas are coming out. Mr. Benoit and I had a disagreement one day about the correct way to talk to people. And I was fairly annoyed with him. And we had a little bit of a shouting match about, how you treat people. And so the next morning, I'm in interview about number 7 or so. And I hear Mo coming up behind me and saying, "Mike, there's somebody you got to see right now." And I was about to say something very rude to him, and I looked at him, and Mo had a very red face, and it was white as a sheet. And I thought, oh. I said, "Right away, Mo." So I said to the person I was interviewing, "You're accepted. Go over there and get your medicals." And next thing, Mo arrives, and he arrives with a 6'2", I would say, Ugandan policeman, sergeant, in impeccable khaki tunic and shorts, shiny boots, a Sten gun in one hand, the most horrible machine gun ever invented by humanity, and a chain in the other. And on the chain, there's an Asian man about this tall, I remember very well, hair all a-hoo, looked like he hadn't slept for days, clothes in very, very bad shape, didn't smell very nice. So I said, "How can I help you?" And he reaches into his pocket and he pulls out this grubby piece of gray British Embassy stationery and opens it up and said, "You called my number." And by God, it was our number. And Mo yells over, "I'm getting his file." So file comes. So I said to the policeman, "Please take off the chain so I can interview." "No, can't do that, sir." So I made them sit like this, one behind the other. And I interviewed the guy across the table, whispering back and forth. So I said, "So what's going on here?" And the story was, this gentleman's wife was an Asian who happened to have Kenyan nationality. The Kenyan nationality holders, along with the Tanzanian and Zambians, had been ordered out of the country. So he was taking his wife to the border to turn her over to her relatives so that she could stay there in hopes that he'd be processed for Canada, and then she could join him. Well, got to the border, and she had her jewelry with her. "Aha, you're smuggling gold." So gold was taken away. She was let leave the country. He was arrested and sent to the Kampala jail. And his family eventually found out he was there, tried to get him out. No way, not going to happen. And 5 days on, they open the paper one morning and look at the list, and by God, there's his number. So they rush down to the jail with the newspaper, demand to see the warden, show him the number. It didn't mean too much to the warden, but he's intrigued. So he calls for this guy to be brought up. The guy produces from God knows where the little piece of paper he'd managed to save all this time. They open it up, the number on our list and the number on the paper, the same number. So I thought to myself, okay, so what do we do now? We're dealing with oppressed minorities. Well, he certainly looked oppressed, and he was clearly a member of a minority. And in addition to which, when I looked at his papers, I realized he's an auto mechanic, 15 points and 7 for skill, enough education, speaks good English, impeccable character. After all, he tried to get his wife out of harm's way. He just sailed through the point system with no problem. So I said to him, okay, now we have to do the medical examination. Now, you know, the clan war between the immigration people and the medical people had not quite subsided, and I was a little nervous about taking him over, but there is Dr. Pichet standing by his little booth, and he says, Michael, I happen to be free at the moment. How can I be of help, of assistance? That's the first home run he hit that day. So I said to him, oh, this man needs a medical right away. And Pichet says to the sergeant, sir, will you kindly take off the cuffs? No, sir, sorry, I can't do that. So Pichet and the man and the chain go behind the curtain, and the sergeant's standing outside with the gun and the chain, which occasionally he wanted to put down on the floor, which scared the hell out of everybody in the room. Every time that gun went up and down, there was this enormous sucking sound all over the room. Anyways, so we're standing there, and I'm standing with the sergeant, and I realize he's got one of his World War II medals is identical to one my dad had. So I said, you've got the same medal as my father. Yes, well, so we have a long talk about the Second World War, and who was doing what to whom during it. And out comes Pichet and says, second home run, he's passed his medical. Michael, he passed his medical. X-ray, stool test, he's passed his medical. God bless you, Father Pichet. So that very minute, St. Vincent shows up, Roger St. Vincent, and he's wearing his blue, Air Force blue safari suit. And he's a fighter pilot. He says, walking like a fighter pilot, boom, boom, boom. And he parks himself right in front of the sergeant, and he says, Sergeant, this man is to be on the flight to Canada tomorrow. You will have him at the gangway at 7:05 precisely. Do you understand? And the sergeant said, yes, sir. And Roger says, make it so. And he turns on his heel and kind of marches away, and the sergeant salutes. So again, there's a bit of an awkward moment. And Dr. Pichet hit number 3. Sergeant, if this goes well tomorrow, you can bring your entire family in for a free medical exam on the government of Canada. Well, smiles, and oh, we'll do this. And I said, the last thing I said to Sergeant is, this man needs to have facilities for a shower and to wash his clothes before you bring him out. It would be wrong for him to leave Uganda in his current condition. And the sergeant said, yes, that will be looked after. So next morning, 7:05, these police cars pull up to the gangway going on to an Air Canada flight, and St. Vincent is standing at the top of the stairs, and out comes everybody, including our man and the sergeant. No machine gun this time, happily. And the two come up the steps, and Roger says, please take off the cuffs. The cuffs are taken off, pushes them behind him into the plane. And the sergeant says, I've never seen an airplane, can I have a look? And Roger's thinking, yeah, all these people are already in the plane. We don't need this. He says, sorry, no, this is Canada, but we're looking forward to seeing you and your family tomorrow. So they go down the step, shake hands, and goodbye. Following morning, 9 o'clock, the big buzz happens in the office. There they are, the sergeant in civils now, very attractive wife, and 5 little kids, all in their best clothes. And they got the medical examination to end all medical examinations. They left with boxes of cookies and medical supplies, and everybody was quite happy with the way that one turned out. So, final tally. In the 60 days we were operating, we put 31 flights into the air. We moved 4,351 passengers and 69 babies in arms. Everybody got a meal according to their religious needs. The Goans got beef, the Muslims didn't get pork, the vegetarians got vegetarian. The government really did it well, and of course when they arrived at the other end, they were very well treated. In all, we issued 6,100 visas, and of that, about 5,900 and something actually came to Canada. Others didn't use them, and many would follow. And the next, I've just been going through the stats, and next year we took. We brought in another almost 2,000 people who had relatives and had popped up here and there, and that we brought in. The last flight went out on November on the 8th of November, and it's remarkable for two things. We identified one case of inactive tuberculosis, and the rules are very strict on that. You must get provincial concurrence before you send someone in that condition. I was assured by the we were assured by the doctors that it's not contagious, but it still requires treatment, and it requires medical surveillance. He was going to a particular province, I won't say which one, and as soon as we identified it, we started sending telexes day after day. We need your concurrence, we need your concurrence. Nothing come. So day 8 comes, we put him on the last flight, and the last message that went from the Canadian team in Kampala went to that province saying, Mr. So-and-so is on the flight. If you'd like to beat the flight and arrange for surveillance, it is entirely up to you. This is Kampala signing off. Click. We went out to watch that last flight go. And we were very strict with the amount of baggage. I mean, this was a long flight. They were going on DC-8s, and they were going across Africa, across the ocean. And we were only allowed by regulations each one to have a single suitcase, and I think it was about 32 kilos of stuff. Well, people leaving their homes forever, this was really tough. But there was not much we could do about it. And when the people got on the buses at the hotel, there was always a big scene as people were opening their 4 or 5 suitcases and deciding what was going to go in the one. Well, as time went on, they began to understand that if they went out to the airport that night, took a chance, they could arrange privately with people to put a little bit more on it. So with the last DC-8, we go out there in the morning to watch it take off, and Roger and I are standing together, and the guy, he goes down to the end of the runway, and he goes, and he comes along, and he comes along, and he comes along. He gets to the very end of the runway, and we think he's going to crash. He's not going to go. It goes off the tarmac, and it just starts to climb ever so imperceptibly, and we headed out over Lake Victoria, and when it went out of sight at the horizon, I swear to God it wasn't more than 1,000 feet up. And I remember saying to Roger, I hope he knows his way around the Atlas Mountains. And they had to stop somewhere along the way for more fuel because of the amount of weight they had on board. So it was a little bit of a last minute heartbeater. I mean, I remember Roger grabbing my hand because he's a pilot, he understands these things, grabbing onto my arm as this thing's coming to the very end, and we're thinking, well, we're going to lose this plane. But anyways, the guy managed to get it off the ground. So just the last couple of words. What was the legacy of this? First of all, in terms of policy, 4 years later, I was back in Ottawa, and we were implementing the 1976 Immigration Act, the first changes since 1952. And there was decision that the refugee provisions would now be in law rather than be floating around there on ministerial discretion. The oppressed minority provision that we used there morphed into what were called the designated classes, where we cut specific definitions for the Indochinese, for people leaving Europe, for people in Latin America, for political prisoners, where we didn't use the convention definition, where we defined the group very precisely to make it easier for selection, and so that the officers would know precisely what the government's intention was with that group. No guesswork. So that came out of this. Flexible criteria for refugees. In fact, we stripped the points out of the point system for that, but all based on our Uganda experience. Private sponsorship was, when my team sat down to do that, I told them about how relieved we were to open a file for a refugee and find that somebody in Canada said, this is my cousin, this is my friend, you send him here to Hamilton, I'm going to look after him. And so I said, this is important that we have that provision because it means we can take a broader spectrum of people. Finally, the WUSC Refugee Scholarship Program, you probably have one on this campus, came out of that program. About 2 years after I got back, somebody from WUSC walked into my office and said, why haven't you got something in the Act for refugees? And I said, have I got a deal for you? And within 2 months, we had that WUSC program in place, and it's more than 1,000 refugee students have come to Canada as a result. Human legacy was quite amazing. Oh, whoa. Is that? I think that's all it. Oh, Uganda.
A little thing like Indochina.
Yeah. What was really important to us, 6 years later, when the government decided to take 60,000 people out of Indochina, there were 4 critical jobs: running Bangkok, running the Singapore operation, running Hong Kong, and coordinating the movement. 3 of the 4 were run by that time, 6 years later, all us young guys are now middle managers, and we were handed the job of running that operation. So 3 of the 4 were Uganda veterans, and the only operation we ever had beef with, although they had a tough job to do, was the one where the manager was not one of the Uganda team. We were able to go to the deputy minister time and time again and say, we've got to change the way this is done. Why do you think you have to do it, fellows? Because it almost killed us in Uganda to do it this way. We need an alternative. And we were able to not only take the technical knowledge, but the political power that gave us to be able to move 60,000 people in 18 months, all based on what we'd learned there. The human legacy is fantastic. That group of people who were essentially a merchant community. I mean, I went through all those applications about 10 or 12 times, always looking for unusual occupations. I found a piano player and a tennis player. Everybody else was a dukawala or a small merchant or a big merchant or a middle-sized merchant or a bookkeeper or an accountant or a secretary. That was the span. And from that, you look at their children today, we have out of that group a senator, 2 ambassadors I know about, heads of major Canadian institutions, richest man in Canada, 50 multimillionaires in Canada from the families that went, teachers, doctors, lawyers, everything. That community and their descendants have become part of the fiber, bone and blood of our community. And we did really, really well by them. And Idi Amin did us a big favor by sending them to us. So I think we were lucky to get them out when we did. They were lucky to get out when they did, because a dark night descended on Uganda not long after. So it just shows that the press may talk about refugees as being a problem for Canada. I'm convinced for the most part they are a huge advantage for Canada. So thank you very much.